Hello, friends. This is Jim Pinkard. I'm with the Office of Post-Secondary Finance and Capital with the Oregon Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And in this slide deck, I wanted to talk through the community college funding distribution model review process that has occurred in the last 18 months or so, review the recommendations that have been made, and then talk about how the calculations actually work. You can see that on the overview slide, which also includes a recap of the 5 parts of our strategic roadmap, the 5 things we'd like to accomplish. And so again, talk about the process, its potential impact as well. And for those interested in the math, that's in the appendix, which is about halfway through the slide deck. We can go through the math itself, but not everybody needs to hear that, of course. So to begin with, the current community college funding distribution model here in the state of Oregon includes 3 components. The first is what we call categorical funding. We sometimes also refer to this as set-asides, but these are dollars taken off the top of the appropriation to support 4 programs right now: contracts out of district, corrections education, distance learning, and a strategic fund. And we'll talk about each one of those in just a couple of minutes in a little bit more detail. There's also a component of the formula for base funding, which provides stable, predictable funding for basic community college district operations. Oftentimes, these are the fixed costs that are consistent and common among the colleges. This payment is weighted to provide sufficient resources to those districts that are smaller, as defined by enrollment size. The largest component of the current model by far is enrollment funding. And you can see it's 93% of the total right now. It considers total public resources to ensure equality of funding. It uses a 3-year weighted average to ensure stability of funding. And it also employs a growth management component to prevent the erosion of funding, which provides predictability of resources to the colleges. So essentially, this model is enrollment driven. It does not consider student demographics, student success, and it's not student-centered in any way. But that's what the current model looks like. It has been in use really since the early 2000s. I think it's the current design of the model really dates back to 2004, after the equalization of funding process concluded. About 10 years ago or so, the growth management component was added after the Great Recession. About 18 months ago, in the fall of 2021, we started a review process because the formula had not been formally reviewed in at least a decade, and it was likely time. Many of the colleges themselves, because they're shifting to a co-requisite developmental education model, they were concerned about how that may impact their funding distribution. And so that and a couple of other reasons is why we endeavored to review the formula, really for its alignment with state goals and a couple of other things, which we'll talk about in a second. But we set up a formula review work group, which eventually included 26 members. They were all appointed again in the fall of 2021. It included institutional representation from all 17 colleges. It also included staff and faculty membership from OEA, the Oregon Education Association, and AFT Oregon, along with representation from the Oregon Community College Association, and of course, HEC staff. The work group itself met for 13 different meetings that started in March of 2022, concluded in February of 2023, and then the administrative rule amendments were adopted by the HEC in June of 2023. Implementation of the new formula is scheduled to begin in fiscal year 2025. The work group developed consensus by group discussion, by survey, by polling. The idea was to focus on the relative level of agreement, not necessarily do you agree or disagree. There was also an attempt to define the level of agreement for those participating in the work group process. A couple of quick additional notes. Members to the work group were appointed by their institution, so the community college presidents appointed members. or the members were appointed by the association they were representing. The work group itself was advisory to HEC staff, who then made recommendations to the commission. Updates and discussion occurred during 9 public meetings of the HEC's Funding and Achievement Subcommittee. So throughout the process, very public and very collaborative process. The review timeline, again, started in fall of 2021, wrapped up in June 2023, so it stretched out over time, almost 2 years. But the idea is that a formula review workgroup process was the first step, and then after that process concluded in February of 2023, then we transitioned to a rules advisory committee process to consider amendments to the existing rules that govern the formula and its distribution. But both processes together led to the adoption of the proposed model. And this is important because existing state law charges the HEC with the responsibility and authority to establish the formula by which state funding is distributed. So it's completely within the authority and up to the Higher Education Coordinating Commission to establish the rules and the process by which the funding is distributed. So that's why we used a formula review workgroup process and a rules advisory committee to inform the rule amendments. At the very beginning of the process in the fall of 2021, the HEC established a number of guiding principles for the review process itself. So 4 key components. They were interested in ensuring that there was a sound and equitable student-focused approach to the policymaking, and that inferred full participation of the institutions and other key stakeholders. So we wanted to be very collaborative throughout. We also wanted to distribute state funding in support of student access and completion. We wanted to align the formula with higher education goals that are currently established here in the state, and wanted to align it with the strategic roadmap. The idea also too was that recommendations should be informed by clearly defined and currently available data. This was important simply because we didn't want to create a lot of additional work for the colleges and their overburdened research and institutional reporting teams. Last, the CCSF formula should apply objectively to all institutions with an emphasis on underrepresented populations. The key here was in some way, shape, or form to recognize that there should be some consideration for underrepresented populations through these conversations and in the new formula design. The workgroup charges were recommended by the commission and then adopted by the workgroup. So it was really a collaborative process there, because this is really the to-do list for the work group. And so we had an idea, of course, what we hoped to get out of this process and what the work group wanted to work on, but we also wanted to allow for them to define what the totality of the work looked like for them, because there are always issues that stakeholders bring to the table that are extremely important and that deserve their rightful place alongside our goals and objectives. And so we focused at the end of the day for the work group themselves, the charges focused on creating a successful and equitable student outcomes driven formula. And that could take many different forms. We wanted the work group to kind of discuss that and provide their perspective on what that could look like. But we also wanted to focus on developmental education, certificate and degree pathways, student affordability if at all possible, funding stability, what role does transferring play in this process? And so many of these charges were very broadly defined on purpose, because the work group was given broad authority and latitude to kind of define this for themselves. The work group very early on established via the current formula that there were some strengths and opportunities with the current formula. So there are discernible elements of it that are strengths, largely considered to be strengths of it. It is stable, it's predictable, it provides the colleges with the autonomy they need to pursue community-based priorities. It supports small colleges effectively through the base payment approach. It equalizes funding appropriately. And when we say equalizes funding, we mean it considers both local property tax resources and state resources. And in its distribution process, it provides the same number of dollars on a per student basis for all 17 colleges. And this is a unique design characteristic used here in Oregon. Not all the states in the nation do that. We're probably one of only a handful of states that does that. And that is largely in and of itself considered to be a strength of the current model. But there are opportunities for improvement. Of course, the current formula could be more student-centered. It could focus on equitable success. And then, of course, what does that look like is part of the conversation the work group had. It could offer additional resources for certain student populations and workforce programs, and it could also align more closely with state goals. All things that we thought we could improve upon. The work group membership themselves, they established a set of principles and implementation guidelines. These are kind of rules of the road. And so they really, I think to their great credit, wanted to walk through a specific set of kind of guide rails. Like, okay, at the end of this process, we really want to, phase in the implementation to allow colleges to respond appropriately, for example. We really want to establish a regular review process going forward. We don't want to wait another 10 years as an example, before we look at this formula yet again. And we really do want it to align with state goals and community-based priorities. So how do we accomplish that? So these principles and guidelines were a useful tool to help guide the work group's decision-making process. The work group reached common ground really around 3 populations. And so they felt strongly throughout their deliberations that we need to do something for adult learners. Adult learners, as in those Oregonians over the age of 25, make up a sizable portion, probably 2/3 to 3/4 of all the students enrolled in our community colleges. And there was a few years ago, I think it was in 2018, an adult attainment goal established in Oregon that speaks specifically to the increased level of attainment we'd like to see out of adult learners. And so doing something, making a recommendation around adult learners would be in alignment with the state's adult attainment goal. They also reached common ground around a focus on community technical education, or CTE, and workforce training students. This would align with workforce and community needs while recognizing the higher cost that these programs offer, or that these programs often represent. They're more expensive to offer at the college level. And so there was some consensus around, can we do something around that? Can we bend the funding to address that in some way? There's a third common ground point. They reached consensus on equitable student success. We really need a more student-centered approach to address existing achievement barriers and pursue equitable student success and equitable student outcomes. So they wanted to do something with adult learners, something with CTE and workforce training learners, and something for equitable student success. And in that vein, we did conduct a survey. In fact, we hired an outside external consulting company called HCM Strategists. They're skilled in the higher education field and have been doing this work for a long time. We brought them in. They conducted a survey of the workgroup membership and related stakeholders and came away with an understanding that focusing on CTE adult learners should use a headcount enrollment approach. There was little appetite for designating high-value CTE courses. There was a lot of conversation around that. If we're doing something for CTE, should we consider high demand, high value, high wage CTE fields and prioritize them? And the work group felt that we likely shouldn't. We should treat all CTE courses and workforce training the same. And in so doing at the state level, by treating them as the same at the state level, it allowed community college by community college to interact with and have those conversations with their community representatives and institutional stakeholders to figure out what workforce programs they felt were important enough to prioritize. We also found through the survey that including priority populations should be done regardless of data limitations. There was a lot of conversation through the work group process about data limitations. So for example, if we were to focus on low-income students, we often use Pell students, Pell Grant eligible students as a proxy because we don't collect income information for students. And so we use Pell eligibility as a proxy. The problem with that, however, is that that doesn't include students who are non-citizens, so DACA students are not included in that, although they would be included in ORSA, so that's one way we can manage that. And not all students apply for financial aid. So only about a third to maybe 40% of current community college students actually apply for financial aid. And so there's 60% of students who we don't have any idea whether they're Pell eligible or not. So there's a distinct data limitation, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, and at the end of all those conversations, it was still determined that, you know, we place a value on trying to help low-income students and underrepresented students. So even though there may be data limitations, we really do think it's important to try as best we can to do something for these priority populations. One of the third key finding, one of the other key findings that appeared through the survey was that it was important to work group members to include both credit and non-credit students, because oftentimes we look at degree-seeking students only to the extent we exclude non-credit students. And for workforce readiness, many of those programs are becoming non-credit in nature, and so we didn't want to leave them out. We think we want to include that component. So including credit and non-credit alike was important, as well as using credit hour benchmarks and limiting the amount of funding to this effort to no more than 10% of total funding. So at the end of the work group process, the work group membership itself proposed a new model, a couple of changes, key changes to the existing model. So they recommended keeping the base payment and equalized enrollment components as is, and distributing the majority of the funding through those components. However, they suggested that and recommended that we add 2 additional components. One would provide additional funding for student support, and one would provide additional funding to incentivize progression and completion, or would focus on student success. Both components will focus on those populations of students who have traditionally in the past faced the highest barriers to success. So we ended up identifying 4 priority populations to focus on. One, the first population is low-income students, because they often face huge barriers. 2 would be adult students, those aged 25 or older. The third population, priority population, is CTE students, workforce training students. So these are students for whom the majority of the coursework that they're enrolled for is either career and technical education related, or it's related to workforce training. So these are students who they may eventually seek a credential, a 1-year certificate, 2-year certificate, an associate's degree. They may eventually transfer to a 4-year public university, but right now the preponderance, the majority of their coursework is focused on getting them workforce and career ready, and we want to prioritize those students in alignment with workforce needs, especially critical workforce needs in our state like healthcare. The fourth priority population is underrepresented students, and this is defined by race and ethnicity. And so essentially it includes all students who have traditionally been underrepresented in the past, and we felt strongly this was an important step forward for our equity efforts to close the completion gaps for the different populations of students. So this is seen as a real strong statement around equitable student success. So this was the proposed model that the Formula Review Work Group came up with at the end of its deliberative process. And we at the HEC support that and certainly encourage the use of it. And so our recommendation as staff to the commission was to adopt the proposed design by adding those two student-centered components, and the HEC commissioners agreed. And so the idea will be to add those two components, to focus on the 4 targeted populations, to limit student-centered funding. By student-centered funding, I'm referring to the funding for both student support and student success combined, but limited that funding to no more than 10% of the total biennial community college support fund amount. The idea also too would be to implement these changes over 5 years, which is 3 biennia, starting with next biennium, the 23-25 biennium, specifically with fiscal year 2025 through 2029. So to implement these changes over a 5-year period, on purpose to slow roll the changes to afford the colleges and their stakeholders the opportunity to adjust and to find out what we don't know yet, really to identify unintended consequences. And we also committed to 2 to 3 years into the process, probably likely during fiscal year 2027, we committed to conducting a technical review to do that, to identify any unintended consequences, to ensure the data definitions are correct, and to ensure that the formula is working how we thought it would. The idea as expressed on the right-hand side of this chart, I think is important. Recent research has found that in order for community college funding systems to be equitable, they must account for the different levels of support needed to provide students from different backgrounds an equal opportunity to succeed. This is exactly what we're trying to accomplish with the recommendations and the revisions to the community college funding distribution model. So in more detail, as we talk about the student-centered funding, specifically it would be based on headcount enrollment. It would use a 3-year weighted average, which is already a component of the model. For the equalized enrollment component, we use a 3-year weighted average. But we would apply additional weighting for students from multiple populations. So again, we're looking at students in 4 priority populations: low income, adults, underrepresented, and CTE workforce training. So for those students who are in multiple populations, let's say they're a low income adult or an underrepresented low income student, then we would provide additional weighting for those students, an additional 20% for students in 2 populations, 30% for students in 3, and 40% for students in all 4 of those populations. For student success, for the other component, we would include both progression and completion metrics using a 3-year weighted average. So the idea, and the work group felt somewhat strongly about this, is that student success in the community college area looks a little bit different than it does for students attending a 4-year university. Success for university students often means and is defined by graduation. Did they finish their 4-year baccalaureate degree? And that's what success is. For community college students, however, success can be defined in a number of different ways. First and foremost, are you making the student college ready? Are they ready to succeed in college? Are you helping them do that? Another area where success is defined is, are you helping them make progress toward a credential? And so we define progression metrics in the student success component as, did they earn 15 hours or more? Did they earn 30 hours or more? And there are non-credit thresholds as well. So if they're enrolled in non-credit degree coursework, there are thresholds for that as well. And did they complete a college level math, English, or writing course, which we often see as a tipping point. After they finish that college level course, that first tough kind of gateway course, once they complete it, it gives them confidence. It gives them confidence to complete additional coursework. And lo and behold, before they know it, they're actually completing a credential and hopefully transferring or getting a job in a workforce need in our state. And then, of course, all credential completions is also how we define success. If they finish a 1-year certificate, a 2-year certificate, if they finish a non-credit certificate that's workforce related, especially if it's a desperate need, workforce, high demand workforce need, but all credential completions. So associate's degree completions, did they transfer to a 4-year university? That's also a completion in a sense. And so we track all those but student success is defined as both progression and completion, not solely completion. And then we add additional weight of 50% for those completions earned by students in those 4 priority populations. The idea is that this is a way to counteract any effort to ensure that students are brought in with the skills they need, right? So there's this idea that, and we see this more on the university side than the community college side around the country, as different states have moved towards some version of outcomes-based funding, we have found an unintended consequence is often that students who are traditionally underrepresented, students who are low income, they'll often disenroll because this serves as an incentive for them not to enroll and not to succeed, which sounds counterintuitive. So to counteract that, to make sure that we send a very strong message to all of our stakeholders that we're interested in equitable student success, we add a very strong additional weight for completions earned by the priority populations so that there's, again, additional resources provided to help those students achieve success. So that, in summary, is what the 2 new components will look like, what they'll try to accomplish, and in specific terms, how we will implement them over time is we'll look to start implementing them with fiscal year 2025. And that implementation period will last through 2029. The idea is to gradually increase the funding available for those 2 new components, as you see on the left-hand side of this chart. In the initial implementation year, it'll be $12.5 million. It will then go to $21 million, grow to 29, 33, 37. So the idea is over time, $12.5 million is about 2%, 37 million is about 7 or 8%. And then after the implementation period, we'll use a full 10% of the Community College Support Fund funding will be used for both the student support and student success components. But the idea during implementation is to slowly build up to that 10% total to ensure that we're providing the colleges enough time and their institutional stakeholders enough time to kind of think through this and implement it in the way that's appropriate for them. Specifically, for the first couple of years of implementation, the funding that is made available for support and success will be divvied up in the first 2 years, 40% for student success and 60% for student support. The idea very simply is that we want to provide more funding upfront to support these students before we then expect them to complete on the back end. So for the first 2 or 3 years of implementation, the first 3 years of implementation, fiscal year 2025, fiscal year 2026, and fiscal year 2027, it'll be a 60-40 split. Thereafter, it'll be a 50-50 split between the 2. Again, we also have committed to reviewing the formula every 5 years in perpetuity, but with a technical review occurring a couple 3 years into the implementation period, again, to identify any unintended consequences. So as we transition to a discussion of how will these recommendations impact, what does this actually do? What does it actually accomplish? So first we talk about the impact on the funding distribution itself, the funding that each college receives. Initial modeling using current data shows that the distributions by college do not change much when compared to the current distribution. And that's likely because so few dollars are being subjected, and because this was based on using $12.5 million, which is only about 2%, 2.5% of the current formula total. So we're taking baby steps on purpose, but in so doing, it shows that the variances to the current model are a standard deviation of plus or minus 0.5%. So on average, no college loses more than 0.5%, 0.5%. No college gains more than 0.5%. That's on average. But when you actually look at that for all 17 colleges individually, the biggest loss is a 0.3% loss The biggest gain is a 1.6% gain. Again, this is based on current data and current student demographic data as well, which could change over time. But summary, big picture takeaway, what are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to ensure the funding distribution model aligns with state goals, and the equity lens in particular. We're trying to ensure it supports the mission of the colleges with a focus on the community in community college. Community workforce needs, community student needs, what do students in that community need to be successful? And it builds on the existing strengths of the current model. And so the current model does a really good job of providing institutional equity because it equalizes funding. It does not include student equity, which is a key step in the right direction that these recommended changes will bring. But when we talk about equity, what's the equity impact? And so this slide is a little bit busy, but this slide speaks to how we at the HEC make equity-centered decisions, specifically around policy, and how we choose to invest in equity practices, and what the logical process is. So you can see on the right-hand side the wheel. We usually in this work, in this analysis, we seek to answer very specific questions, right? Like it's a Q&A question and answer format, but the idea is very specific questions try to get at very specific issues around, are you defining the benefits and burdens? Are you considering deeper equity issues? Are you trying to mitigate and enhance impacts as examples? So this just lays out the equity impact protocol, the process by which we analyze, are we making equity-centered decisions in our policy choices? And when we do that for this work, when we actually consider the equity impacts, one of the key questions, and there's a larger report, an equity impact analysis report that walks through each and every one of the equity protocol questions and provides answers, and it is available from the HEC. These next few slides just walk through some of the highlights. But one of the key questions in that effort, in that protocol, was who are the racial, ethnic, and underserved groups that would be affected by this? And so you can see on the right-hand side of this chart that in the past 5 years, the completion and transfer rates for our Oregon community colleges by ethnicity, by race ethnicity group, there are still substantial gaps. Still substantial gaps, and so there's unequal completion rates that we're trying to address. So even though across the board we've seen growth, we've seen improvement in most, if not all, of these rates, what we haven't seen is a closing of the gaps between the groups. And that over time is ultimately what we're trying to achieve with these recommended changes and amendments to the distribution model. But on the left-hand side of this chart, you can see again, just to recap the 4 groups, the priority populations that we're really trying to focus on: adult learners, CTE workforce training, and equitable student success. We're pursuing equitable student success really through 2 of the 4 groups: low-income students and then students who are traditionally underrepresented as defined by race, ethnicity. One of the other key questions in the equity impact protocol is, what is the potential impact of the resource allocation? And I like this question because it's broad, as it should be. And so this gives us a chance to kind of step back and really consider, what is the impact of our decision making here? And so you can see on the left-hand side the projected student support and student success funding by category. This would be for the first year of implementation. And you can see the pie chart very clearly shows that the majority of the funding, almost 80% of it, would be allocated for the 4 priority populations. The remaining 20% would be allocated for progression and completion of all students. And so this is a really heavy emphasis on equitable student success. But funding for the priority populations exists in both the student support and success components. And so that 78%, when you look at the $12.5 million, is roughly $9.7 million. So for fiscal year 2025, $12.5 million would be made available for both student success and student support. And as a result, 9.7 million of that 12.5 million, or roughly 78%, would be distributed based on the priority population students and their success. And you can see over time throughout the implementation period what that would look like, right? For fiscal years 25 through fiscal year 2029. After the implementation period concludes, starting with fiscal year 2023, 10% of all the available funding for the Community College Support Fund will be made available for student support and success. Of that 10%, we estimate 7 to 8%, or 70 to 80% of that available funding will be distributed for student support and success, specifically for the priority population students. So when you look at this in more specific detail, 12.5 million is about 2.6% of the total available funding. But the percent by college ranges from 1.5% to 5.5% based on student characteristics at each college. So what that tells me is that on average, a student, a college should receive 2.6% of their funding for student support and success. But if, however, they enroll and they complete and they help those priority population students succeed, if they enroll more than the average percent of priority population students and they help those students succeed, they will likely receive more than 2.6%. So one of the colleges under our initial modeling would receive a full 5.5% because essentially they're receiving more than their fair share, because they're doing two things. One, they're enrolling more priority population students, and two, they're helping those same students complete and succeed. And so they're getting recognition, financial recognition through the formula for the good work that they're doing. So this potential impact on the resource allocation is very important. One of the other key questions in the Equity Impact Protocol was, how have you intentionally involved stakeholders who are also members of the communities affected? And this was really interesting because of the indirect nature of the funding formula. And so when you review a funding formula or a distribution model, it's common nationally in states across the nation to focus on the institutions themselves during a review cycle, simply because they are the ones that benefit directly from the decision making. We fund the institutions through the Community College Support Fund. We don't fund the students directly. We fund them indirectly, but not directly. So because the colleges benefit directly from this decision making, it is often common practice to involve them and many of their institutional stakeholders. I give the college presidents credit because during the review process, they did a great job of selecting members from their campus communities that would represent a diverse collection of perspectives. And so there were a number of student affairs professionals who were included on the work group because they were included to weigh in on the connection between any proposed formula changes and the student support services that they offer. So these are folks who day in and day out, they're on their college campus, they're supporting students in a very direct and tangible way, and they're the ones creating and innovating the student supports needed to help students succeed and achieve their definition of success. So we felt it really important to include their voices to represent that connection between, hey, what are we considering in terms of changes to the formula, and how might that affect how you serve students on your campus? But that begs the obvious question, what about the student voice? There were no students directly included in the workgroup membership. And it's not necessarily that was a failure, but it's certainly room for improvement. Student voices add value, especially in terms of considering how to provide services needed at the campus level. And their voice, I think, is integral to and has to be included at the campus level when you talk campus by campus about how to serve your community. They have to be included in those conversations. It's just that those conversations did not occur for this formula work group process, simply because this formula does not dictate or determine the types of services, student support services, the magnitude of student support services at the campus level. That conversation occurs at the campus level. But there's, again, opportunity to improve for future review cycles. So I think going forward, it would be appropriate to include stakeholders who both directly benefit and indirectly benefit from this decision-making process. So that could include workforce partners, industry partners, community organization partners, as well as students. Maybe there's an opportunity to include, because all of those folks, workforce partners, industry partners, community-based organization partners, students, they all indirectly benefit from this policymaking. And so I think there's opportunity to include them as indirect beneficiaries going forward. But also I think there's an opportunity to consult with existing equity-focused groups. As we see more of them being created and more of them focusing on policy, I hope going forward we can work and collaborate with them and partner with them on better understanding how this process needs to unfold. And so as we move toward a more equitable distribution model, we first have to recognize that funding distribution models affect equity in two ways. So we differentiate between institutional equity, whereby we're providing the colleges themselves with the equitable resources they need to support students, versus student equity, which focuses on equitable access and equitable success. So the current community college funding distribution model does include an institutional equity focus. By that we mean it provides equalized resources. So between state funding and local property tax revenues added together, it provides the same number of dollars per full-time student equivalent to all 17 colleges to support them in their efforts. So the current model focuses on institutional equity. It does not, however, include any sort of student equity focus. And so the proposed model, in adding student equity focus based on student demographics, the proposed model would do both for the first time in our state's history. And so the student support and student success will explicitly include race as a consideration. And this is important nationally because that would make Oregon one of only 15 states to do that. There are some states where they are prohibited from including race as a metric, as a consideration. And so we're unique in one of the handful of states who can do that, which we think is a step in the right direction. But once implemented, this new model, distribution model, will provide additional funding of about 12% per student based on initial calculations. And that calculation is included in the table on the right-hand side of this chart, where we see that the enrollment funding per student under the current model is about $3,900, and under the proposed model using current data, it would drop to $3,500. So essentially what that means is that the funding we provide for enrollment alone would drop, because we would be adding funding for the priority population students, and that's about $400 per student, which is roughly 10%. If you divide $406 divided by 3,524, you get 12%. So essentially, bottom line, we're saying that this new model will provide an additional 12% of funding per student for those population students. Now, is 12% enough? Likely not. And it's a modest step in the right direction. The magnitude of that step could be bigger, and hopefully we can improve it over time moving forward. But this is a starting point down that path. As we talk about the impact of these proposed changes, we talked about the impact to the funding distribution for the colleges. We talked about the impact on equity. The third impact we want to talk about is the impact of student affordability. And this is complicated because there's no universal definition of affordability. What is affordable is often perspective driven. What's affordable to one person might not be affordable to another. But nevertheless, there are three kind of policy buckets, if you will, three policy levers that work in coordination together to support student affordability. So the first is the institution support funding itself. So increasing the level of state funding support to the colleges through the community college support funding formula reduces the student share of the total cost of instruction. And so that's an important way to positively influence student affordability. More funding for the institution support will reduce the reliance on funding coming from the student and their family to pay for college. Another policy lever that we can use is student financial aid. So more efficiently designed financial aid programs that focus on economic need, financial need, will benefit low-income students and will improve student affordability. In fact, just recently, through our Office of Research and Data here at the HEC, they published a review of the Oregon Opportunity Grant program, and the Oregon Opportunity Grant program here in Oregon has shown to improve completion rates for low-income students, and so it's worthy of additional state investment. But the third policy area is transfer pathways. So if we can eliminate barriers to completion with common course numbering schemes and guaranteed matriculation programs and other approaches, by eliminating barriers to student success and completion, hopefully that'll ease the way and affect affordability as well on behalf of students. And so on the right-hand side, research shows, for every additional $1,000 a state spends on its public four-year colleges and also two-year schools, the students' odds of earning a degree increase, the students' odds of taking on debt decreases, and the total amount of debt that a student owes generally is less over time. And so it's important to understand we need all three of these policy levers working in coordination together to influence student affordability. And with that, I've been speaking now for a good 45 minutes or so. With that, we come to the end of a discussion about the formula funding review process and the recommendations we're making as a Higher Education Coordinating Commission and the potential impact of those recommendations going forward. Here in the appendix, we want to transition to a discussion around the distribution model itself and the specific calculations. And so this is where we show you the math. And so for those of you who are interested in seeing exactly how the calculations come together, please listen, continue following along with me. But for those who are interested in the policy, this is where your journey can end if you so choose. But for the rest of this presentation, the remaining 20 slides or so, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of exactly how the calculations come together. And so I hope this level of detail is suitable for some, not suitable for everyone, but I hope you'll find this interesting for those who continue on. So the first step is just showing you a summary of the distributions. So it's important here to understand in Oregon, there's a legislatively adopted community college support fund for the HECS distribution. And in the current biennium, that totals $699 million for the biennium. Of that $699 million, we take about $10 million off the top for the four categories of funding. We briefly mentioned the four at the within the first couple slides of this presentation. And so we reiterate those. We'll be adding to, of course, starting in fiscal year 2025. But right now we're taking about $10 million off the top, and we allocate that $10 million contractually through grant agreements with the colleges who need that funding. Not all 17 need corrections funding or contracts out of district funding, for example. The remaining pot of dollars, about 689, is distributed to the colleges through base payments and enrollment funding. And the amount per college is determined by formula via administrative rule with authority granted to the HEC in Oregon Revised Statutes, Chapter 341, Section 626. So again, you've seen this, but the components of the formula right now are categorical funding, base funding and enrollment funding. We talked about that briefly at the very beginning of this slide deck. We reiterate this to show you that the current model in the middle of this chart shows that 93% of the funding is distributed solely for enrollment. Under the proposed model, with the recommended changes we're making, that total will drop by about 10% because the 10% will now be allocated for student support and student success, which are the two new set-asides that we're recommending for inclusion in the formula. That 10%, of course, will be once the formula is fully implemented. So it'll start out at 2%, roughly about 2.5% in the first year of implementation. It'll grow to 4%, 5, 7, 8, and eventually get to 10%. So that red slice of the pie, if you will, on the far right, will start out at about 2.5% and grow to 10% over time once fully implemented. The categories of funding or the set-asides, again, there are 4 right now, and these are specific programs with funding subtracted from the appropriated amount. It's taken off the top, and then the funding is distributed via grant agreement. So the 4 programs include corrections, and this is funding to allow adults in custody in the prisons here in Oregon to take community college courses and get credit. The allocation changes by the same percentage as the overall funding level. The Contracts Out of District is a program that allows students who are not living in a service district to take classes at a neighboring community college district. And what this small amount of funding will do is it will reimburse the offering district, allowing them to charge that student an in-district tuition rate. So essentially we're subsidizing the funding so that the student doesn't have to pay a larger non-district or out-of-district tuition rate. The District Learning Program provides funding in an effort to increase distance learning programs in all districts. And so the idea here is, especially for some of the more rural community college districts, we want to provide some funding to allow them to focus energies and efforts on offering distance learning options for students who may not be able to travel because they're place bound or for whatever reason. The strategic fund is the largest one of the 4 categories by number of dollars. Right now it's about $5 million or 0.75% of the total CCSF, but it funds strategic statewide initiatives for all 17 of the colleges. It also will from time to time provide funding for the colleges to meet new legislative requirements. So the student support and student success funding components will be part of the categorical funding or the set-asides. So right now we have 4 set-asides. We'll add 2, so there'll be 6 total under the new formula, under the new distribution model. And we've talked a little bit about student support. The calculation will be based on head count. It'll be based on a 3-year average, a 3-year weighted average of data. So we use 3 years to smooth out the data, to smooth out any volatility from year to year. And it's weighted so that 30% of 1 year, 30% of the second year, and 40% of the most recent year is used. So we essentially overweight the most recent year of data and then go back an additional 2 years beyond that. Additional weighting will be added for students from multiple groups, 20% for students in 2 groups, 30% for students in 3, and then 40% for students in 4 groups. Again, the priority groups are low-income students, adults, underrepresented students, and students taking CTE or workforce training. And so on the right-hand side in the table, using current data, and we're using the last 3 academic years, 2019-20, 2021-2020, we're using the last 3 years, 2019-20, 2020-2021, and 2021 and 2022. So the last 3 most recent academic years of data. And this chart, this table on the right-hand side shows you by population, 1, 2, 3, or 4, the weighted average number of head count students. So there were 64,486 students that were in one of those 4 priority populations. There were 62,711 students in 2 of those priority populations, and 3 and 4. And they're incremental, so they're discrete. Those are students who are either in 1, 2, 3, or 4. They're not duplicated. But then we add the points, and so you can see for one population, 64,486 students equals 64,486 points. But for the 2 populations, we add 20%. We add 20% weight, so 62,711 students multiplied by 1.2 with 20% extra weight translates to 75,253 points. And we do the same for 3 and 4 students, 1.3, 1.4. So you can see how that all translates out. So essentially 88% of the points are going to be distributed and allocated for students in 1 or 2 populations. So that's where the majority of those students are. And this is a hypothetical example of exactly how these calculations would work. So this is assuming we had $1 million in funding for student support. And the calculations are pretty straightforward. It's a points-based allocation. But essentially, the first step, we calculate the weighted average for each population group. And then the second step is to calculate the number of points by applying the population weights. And then third, proportionally, we allocate the funding based on the available funding and based on the points. So we proportionally allocate the available funding based on the number of points. So let's give you an example. So college A here, and we see in this table we have 3 colleges, hypothetically, college A, college B, college C. Focusing on college A just for a second, we note that the weighted averages by the number of populations is 1,221 for 1, 1,205 for 2, 250 for 3, 18 for 4. So if we take all those and multiply them by the population weights, you can see that at the very bottom of the slide, that gives us 317 points for college A. And then if we divide the 317 points for college A into the 27,429 total points, and then we multiply that by the available funding of $1 million, we get $109,000. So the 3,017 points is roughly 10% of the 27,000 points. So they get roughly 10% of the available dollars. So it's a points-based allocation. When we talk student success, it works in a very, very similar way, a points-based allocation. 3-year weighted average of student success metrics, including both progression and completion. The weights are applied by type of success metrics. So for example, the progression metrics, we use 10%. For completion metrics, we use 100%. And for completions by priority populations, we use 150%. So you can see in the table on the right, for the coursework thresholds, as in students who earn 15 hours or more, students who earn 13 hours or more, there were 47,830 successes over the last 3 years. And so we multiply that by 10% and we get 4,784 points. We do the same for the gateway courses, completions, priority completions. So for completions, for example, there was 11,984 on average completions of all kinds, of all credential types over the last 3 years. So we multiply that by 100%, we get 11,984 points. For priority completions, this is the completions earned by students who identify as one of those 4 priority populations. So there were 10,251 completions for priority students in the last 3 years. So we multiply that by 1.5 because we're adding 50%, a 50% weight for that. So that translates, that 10,251 completions translates to 15,376 points. So you can see that's roughly 43%. So because 43% of the points are for priority completions, that means 43% of the total available funding will also be distributed for these priority completions. So how does that actually work? Using a hypothetical example, just like we did for student support, similar approach, same 3 steps. You calculate the weighted average for each group of metrics. Step 1, step 2, you calculate the number of points by applying the metric weights. And then third, you proportionally allocate the available funding based on the number of points for each college. So in this example, we have 3 colleges. At the bottom, we show you the detailed calculations for college A, first applying the metric weights and then proportionally allocating it. So college A, their 720 points, that represents about 11.4% of the 6,313 points. So they also get 11.4% of the available funding, or $114,000. So that covers the calculations for the student support and student success components. Those are the 2 new components that we're adding. Now I want to walk you through how we calculate the base payments and the enrollment distribution amounts. And so this has not changed from the current formula. This is how the current formula works, and this is how the new formula will work as well. So this is not changing at all. So if you've already heard this conversation, you can skip it. But the idea is that there are essentially 3 steps to calculate the base payment and then the enrollment payments. But there are 3 kind of sub-steps or preliminary steps that we take to determine the number of funded full-time equivalent students. So we first start off with calculating the number of reimbursable full-time equivalent students. And the number of reimbursable students, that's directly reported by all the colleges using FTE guidelines published by the HEC. This data is reported every term to the HEC Office of Research and Data, and then the HEC Office of Research and Data calculates the reimbursable FTE, and they provide that data to us here in the Office of Post-Secondary Finance and Capital. And then we take the reimbursable FTE count, we apply the growth management component to determine how many of those reimbursable FTE should be eligible for funding in any given year. So we apply the growth management component to determine the number of fundable FTEs for each given year. And then we take the fundable FTE for each year and we calculate the number of funded FTE by using the 3-year weighted average. And so all 3 of those preliminary steps have to occur to determine the number of funded full-time student equivalents before we can calculate the base payment or the enrollment payment. So what are reimbursable FTE? This chart answers that question. Reimbursable students are residents of Oregon and our neighboring states who are taking courses physically here in the state of Oregon. This includes high school students attending community college in the state. Reimbursable courses include a broad swath of courses: career technical education, lower division collegiate, adult basic skills, and on. Essentially, the only courses that are non-reimbursable, as noted on the right-hand side of this chart, are those classes provided at a location outside of the state. These are also non-qualified classes as defined in state law. Typically, that means hobby and recreation type classes or personal enrichment classes. And we define a full-time student equivalent as a student taking, or a student who, what we do is we actually calculate the number of clock hours, and then we define it by, then we divide that number, the total number of clock hours is divided by 510 to get the number of full-time student equivalents. And where does 510 come from? That's simply 34 weeks for 3 terms times 15 hours per week, which is considered full-time. And that's where we get 510 from. But essentially 1 FTE equals 510 clock hours. And we use clock hours, of course, because of credit and non-credit coursework. So again, the fundable FTE is determined by applying the growth management component or growth management calculation to the number of reimbursable FTE. So the idea behind the growth management component, it is intended to prevent the erosion in the level of funding per FTE for all colleges with a greater than 1,100 FTE count. So this compares the reimbursable FTE to prior year data to determine each district's number of fundable FTE as shown in the example below. This is for one district. This is hypothetical data, but an annual growth factor is calculated, and that's a separate calculation shown on the following slide, which is somewhat complicated. I won't take you through every step, but it's listed in detail on the following slide. But there's an annual growth factor that's calculated that is then used to apply a prior year FTE cap. So it's essentially, there's a preliminary cap which applies the prior year FTE or the growth factor, and then there's a second preliminary cap which applies the prior year fundable FTE versus the growth factor. So the annual growth factor is important because it's used as a comparison tool, again, to prevent the erosion of funding. So this compares reimbursable FTE to prior year data to determine the number of fundable FTE based on an FTE cap. And here's the annual growth factor calculation. It's multiple steps, and you can follow along. This chart is exactly step by step how we calculate the annual growth factor. But when we have the number of fundable FTE, we use the number of fundable FTE over 3 years to calculate the number of funded FTE. This is where the weighted average comes in. So the 3 years prior fundable FTE, we take 30%, 2-year prior fundable FTE, we take 30%, and the most recent prior year fundable FTE, we take 40%. An example, a hypothetical example is shown on the bottom left of this chart. But that equals the number of funded FTE. It's a weighted average, but that funded FTE count is really important because that number of FTE is then used in the calculation of the base payment. The base payment, just stepping back for a second, giving you a quick overview, it provides funding for essential district operations, often fixed costs associated with running a college campus. It increases stability and predictability for the institution, and a size factor is used essentially to provide a small district supplement. And so all districts receive credit for 1,100 what are called realized FTE. The payment is based on an amount in rule plus inflation. So right now, that is $973 per full-time student equivalent. The base payment then is adjusted for any unrealized FTE. These would be for if you're a college with fewer than 1,100 full-time student equivalents, you get an additional payment for any FTE below that 1,100 cap, and the dollar value of that payment is 1/2 of the amount so it's 1/2 of the $973 amount. The college size factor is then applied based on the number of funded FTE. So that sounded complicated, but this chart gives you 2 examples of exactly how the calculations work. So in the example for District A, they have 1,646 total funded FTE. So they're given funding for 1,100 of those times $973, so that's just under $1.1 million. Because they have more than 1,100 FTE, there's no adjustment whatsoever, and then that preliminary base funding of just under 1.1 million is adjusted by the college size factor. All of the college size factors were listed on the previous chart, but in this case, the size factor is 1.2062 multiplied by the 1.07 million, so their base payment is $1.3 million. Contrast that to District B. They have fewer than 1,100 FTEs, so their calculation starts off with their 483 funded FTE multiplied by the $973, so that's 470,000. But because they have fewer than 1,100 FTE, they're eligible for a base adjustment. They get an additional payment of $300,000 based on the difference between the 1100 FTE and their current enrollment size of 483. So that difference, 1100 minus the 483 of 617, that number of FTE is multiplied by $487 per FTE, which is half of the 973, or half of the realized FTE amount. And so 617 times $487, $300,000. So added to the 470, you get a total of 770. That's then adjusted by their college size factor. In this case, it's 1.3513. The college size factors are inversely related to the number of FTE. At 5,000 FTE, essentially, the size factor is 1.0. So if your college is greater than that, the size factor is 1.0. Essentially, there's no adjustment after that. And the fewer FTEs you have, the size factor grows. 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, it goes higher the lower your FTE count is. So in this case, District B, because they're so small, 483 students, they get a sizable college size factor, 1.35. So their base payment is 1.04 million. So it's important on the left-hand side to note that by design, the larger the district is, the fewer dollars they're going to receive per student for a base payment. So in this case, District A, they get $784 per student for their base payment. District B gets $2,155 per student because of a lack of an economy of scale. So that's the base payment. As we transition to the total public resources, or the enrollment, the equalized enrollment payment, this chart walks you through the calculations. So we first calculate the total public resources available. When we say total public resources, we're talking about the state funding available, in this case $347.9 million, and the property tax revenue available, in this case $210 million. You add those together and you have $557 million available for distribution. So then we subtract from that the base funding amount. So in this case, 19.3 million is the total amount of all 17 colleges, all 17 of their base payments. You add it together, it's 19.3 million. So when you subtract that from the available funding of 557, you get 538.5 remaining. And then the total number of funded FTEs across all 17 districts in this particular year, using fiscal year 2022 data, we had 72,606 funded full-time student equivalents. So when you divide that into the $538.5 million available for funding, you get $7,684 in total public resources available per FTE across all 17 colleges. And that's an important starting point, because then we apply, so each and every college will receive $7,684 per student. But then on the right-hand side, in the table on the right-hand side, we have to calculate the relative share of that $7,684 that's made up of property taxes. And so how we do that is we take the proportional share. So in this example, which is a hypothetical example, District A, their fundable FTE count of 1,836 divided by the total number of funded FTEs for all 17 colleges of 72,606. So District A has 2.5% of the total number of funded FTEs. So we apply that 2.5% to the total available funding of $538.5 million. And we see that their funding in terms of the number of dollars would be $13.5 million. So of the $538 million that's available for distribution, they're going to receive $13.5 million of that 538. So we take the $13.5 million and then we subtract out the property tax assessments, because that $6.2 million in local property tax revenue they keep. They don't send that to the state. They keep it at the local level. But what we do is essentially we consider the fact that they have that $6.2 million. So we subtract that from the $13.5 million total. The remainder is $7.3 million, and that's the number of state funding dollars that we will distribute, we at the HEC will distribute to them for that fiscal year. So this is how we equalize the funding and how we calculate the number of state dollars to send to each and every one of the 17 colleges. It, upon first blush, is a little overwhelming, but when you walk through step by step, I think it makes a little bit more sense, and hopefully my explanation will help you better understand exactly how those calculations work and how the funding works. These next two charts are a little bit busy, but this shows you for all 17 colleges, again, this is for fiscal year 2022, this shows you that each college receives a different amount of state funding as a percent of the total public resources. So in total, again, $7,684, each college receives the same level of funding. Now on this chart, you see the TPR per funded FTE is a little bit different. And that's because this includes the base payment. So for example, Blue Mountain receives $8,328, which is a little bit higher than the average because they're a smaller institution, and so their base payment is a little bit larger than some of the other institutions. But you can see of the $8,328 that Blue Mountain received, $5,102 of that, or 62% of that was for property taxes. So the state funding as a percent of their TPR was only $3,226 of their total, which is about 38%. So on average, across all 17 colleges, 62%, a full 62% on average for each college of their total public resources comes from the state, but that varies widely based on the college. So you can see, for example, Blue Mountain and Central Oregon, they collect more in property taxes relative to the state funding. So the two of them are at the lowest end of state funding as a percent of TPR, whereas on the other end of that spectrum, Columbia Gorge and Klamath are at 83%. So they collect less in property taxes as a percent of TPR. And this last chart just shows you the calculations for all 17 colleges. It shows you the base payments and how they're calculated, and then the enrollment payments for all 17 colleges. Again, this is using fiscal year 2022 data, and this is for all 17 colleges across the state. So this was how we allocated the $347.9 million in state funding for all 17 colleges. So that, in conclusion, is a look at all 17 colleges and what they received for fiscal year 2022. And I hope that these slides, especially here in the appendix, gives you a better understanding of how the math works. But from a larger perspective, I hope this slide deck has given you an understanding of how the formula review process worked, the collaborative nature of it, the recommendations that we made, how those recommendations will impact the funding, the equity, and student affordability, and then gives you an idea of how the calculations actually work, how the math works in terms of how we at the HEC calculate the distribution by college. And I'll leave it there. Here at the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, you can reach us online or at our physical address, and hopefully we'll see you real soon at one of our public hearings. And if you have any questions at any time, feel free to reach out to us. There is detailed contact information for all of us and the Office of Post-Secondary Finance and Capital on our website. Feel free to reach out to us and ask questions as they occur, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully real soon.